Good afternoon. My name is Jessica, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Midwest and Great Plains Drought Update webinar. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. Thank you. John Ives, you may begin your conference.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's Drought Update webinar. Our speaker today is Dr. Martha Shilsky. She is the director of the High Plains Regional Climate Center. And Martha, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Although I'm giving the presentation, this is a collaborative effort among a number of different groups and individuals. Those are listed here. Those include state climatologists, NOAA, American Association of State Climatologists, Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. The next webinar will be given on June 20th and monthly thereafter. You can find information to future webinars at the URL given below. So an agenda for today, this is really a tale of two regions, even though we are talking about one region, and I'll explain more about that a bit later. I'll get into current conditions, talk a bit about the extremes that we've seen across the region, give you a drought update as well as impacts. I'll go into outlooks, and then I'll have an opportunity for questions and comments. So in terms of April temperatures, this is the statewide temperature ranking where we've seen much colder than normal conditions across the central U.S. It was actually the top 10 coldest April on record for 6 states in the region. North Dakota was nearly 10 degrees below average at 31 for the month. If we look at precipitation, we've seen wetter than normal conditions for a lot of the middle of the country in the southeastern U.S. It was a top 10 wettest April on record for 5 states in the region. Iowa and Michigan had the wettest on record at nearly 6 to 7 inches. Those were both more than 200% of normal precipitation for the month, set new records. So you can see the cold and the wetness somewhat overlapped. The cold was a bit further west, and the wetness was a little bit further east in the central region. For the most recent 30-day departures, this is from the middle of April to the middle of May. You can see in the upper left-hand corner where we have temperature departure from normal. So anything in the green and blue is below normal temperatures. So much of the country was below normal or has been below normal for the last 30 days. Some significant departures have been in the upper plains and upper Midwest of greater than 6 degrees Fahrenheit below normal, where we've been above normal on the West Coast and in the Northeast. If we look at percent of normal precipitation over the most recent 30 days, we can see the area of wetness where we've had more than 150% of normal precipitation for portions of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and into Wisconsin and Minnesota. But for the western part of the region, more the high plains and northern plains, precipitation over the last 30 days has been 50% or lower of normal. So dry in the west and wet in the east, so that's why I'm calling it a tale of two regions. If we look at 30-day precipitation amounts, we can see where it has been much wetter than normal, where the 150% of normal and greater, the precipitation amounts have been 7 inches or greater in that region. And if we look to the west, I'm referring to the upper left image here on this slide. If we look to the west, the western part of the region, we've seen 3 inches or less total precipitation over the last 30 days. And in the lower right-hand image, you're seeing a similar graphic to what I showed earlier. This is percent of normal precipitation over the last 30 days. So again, wet in the east and dry in the west. So I talked about the cold that we've had in the middle of the U.S. as well as the wetness. And if we look at weather map for April, we can determine why this is the case. And this is what's going on at the middle levels of the atmosphere, about 500 millibars. So this is actually a height of that 500 millibar level. And anything that you see in the warm colors, that would be a ridge pattern, high pressure. Anything that you see in the cool colors would be indicative of a trough pattern or low pressure systems moving through the area. So we've seen a pretty active weather pattern for April for the middle part of the country, and that's brought the cooler than normal and wetter than normal conditions for this area. We've seen some late season snows. Seen quite a bit of snowfall middle to late April and actually into early May. I believe last time we showed you on the last webinar, we showed a map of snowpack conditions across the country. I chose not to show one this time because the seasonal snowpack has all melted. Much of that happened in late April. But we did have a storm system that brought some pretty significant snows in early May. And it somewhat stalled out in the middle part of the country and actually retrograded or moved backwards, so to speak, moved westward a bit, and so resulted in some pretty heavy snowfalls. We had some new monthly records for the month of May, and those are listed here. Rochester saw over a foot of snow. There were several locations in Minnesota that saw over a foot of snow. That's a new record. Actually, no location in Minnesota had ever seen more than a foot of snow in May. We've got a record for Wisconsin, Des Moines, Iowa, and Omaha, Nebraska. And the snowfall did reach as far south as Dodge City, Kansas, and Springfield, Missouri. And I believe there was trace amounts of snow as far as Arkansas. So you're seeing some images there from Lincoln and from Rochester. Okay, continuing on with the winter theme. I've got a slide here on lake ice, and this one refers to Minnesota. And on the left, you're seeing the lake ice out dates. This is the 2013 lake ice out dates, and you can find these at the URL below. And the key of timing of ice out is to the right of the image. There's historical data available at this site. But one thing to note in checking these individual lakes, I noticed that many of the lakes that is near record or record ice out date, these records go back fairly substantial for Minnesota. And it's interesting to compare 2013 with 2012, where that was a very early, record early ice out date for much of the lakes. We had a very interesting ice event on, I believe it was the 13th of May, where we had what's called an ice tsunami. We had very high winds, around 40 miles per hour in central Minnesota. This image is from Lake Mille Lacs, which is north central Minnesota. It's a fairly large lake. And the winds, there was still ice on the lake, and these very strong winds pushed the ice fairly far inland, and you can see it crushed and damaged some homes in the area. So it's somewhat unusual to see this type of event and see ice come this far on shore and make it to some of the houses. In terms of snow water equivalents, we can look at where we were compared to a month ago. This is water equivalent. It's a percent of the median value. So we have passed the peak in snow water equivalent for the Rocky Mountains. So we are past that, but this just gives you an indication of percent of normal in terms of water equivalents for this time of year. So you can see mostly warm colors there. If you look in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana in particular, you can see most of the region is showing below normal snow water equivalent. We do have some portions in Colorado that are near or at normal for this time of year, but for the most part, we're behind where we should be in terms of water equivalents in that snowpack for the Rocky Mountains. Switching to stream flow, here we're also comparing conditions as of a couple days ago compared to where we were a month ago. One thing that was talked about on the last webinar was flooding for the Midwestern region in particular. We have seen some heavy rains in that area. But the positive thing to note, I guess, is stream flows are lower than what they were a month ago. So we're seeing a bit of subsiding in terms of stream flow for this region. If you look in North Dakota in particular, you can see we've had snowmelt, majority of the snowmelt occur within the last month, and so we're seeing stream flow conditions that are above average for this area. So you can see the blue dots there indicating 90% or more of normal. And if you look a bit to the south and in the western portion of the Central Plains, you'll note that much of the stream flow is below normal. And so this is kind of an indication of the continuing dry conditions for this part of the region. If we take a look a bit at Mississippi flooding, we have a current conditions map. This is as of a couple of days ago. You can see which areas are experiencing minor and moderate flooding. This is the area that we were certainly watching a month ago. Again, we have experienced heavy rains in this area. But this is the current conditions for flooding along the Mississippi and the Illinois rivers. If we look at the predicted conditions in the Mississippi Basin, this is for 1 week out. So you're seeing continued minor to moderate flooding along portions of the Mississippi River in the previous graphic that I showed. They're predicting no flooding for portions further north in this area into Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So it's looking like we're past the worst in the near future anyway. If we take a look at soil moisture across the region in comparison to what it was 1 month ago. So on the right would be the most recent soil moisture condition. This is from May 9th. And you can certainly see a gradient from west to east, where we're still quite dry in portions of Nebraska, pretty much all of Nebraska, much of Kansas and South Dakota and eastern Colorado and eastern Wyoming as well. We're seeing very dry conditions. This is an anomaly in millimeters, and so the 50 to 100 millimeter range would be 2 to 4 inches. And this soil moisture anomaly, this is in the total column. So we're not looking at a particular depth, we're looking at a total column soil moisture anomaly. And if we look further to the east in the Midwestern region, you can see the areas in purple there where we have a positive anomaly. So much more moist in the east and fairly dry in the west still. If we take a look at soil temperatures, they have recently, within the last week or two, gone above 50 in Nebraska and Kansas and areas further north. And if we look at some of the language on the graphic here, at 40 degrees soil temperature at 4 inches, wheat can develop. The 50-degree mark, that's when corn can develop. So typically this is an indication that producers will look at in terms of when they want to plant, if it's at a temperature suitable to which the seed will emerge. If we look further to the east, you can see that temperatures are in the 60 and above category. And the cooler soils in the central high plains and northern plains, that's one factor that has delayed corn planting. The wetness is a factor that has delayed corn planting in the east. The soils were warm enough, but they were too wet to get into the fields. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. If we look at corn planting progress, this is a comparison over the spring and early summer months from 1995 to 2013. So this year, and this graphic is as of May 12th, which is Sunday, and so some planting obviously has taken place since this time, and this is covering the whole U.S. as opposed to a particular region. But you can see how 2013 compares to the last decade or so. And if we compare to the average, 2013 is certainly below average as of May 12th, about 30% below average. If we compare 2013 to 2012, obviously a lot of planting happened early. We had a very early spring. It was dry, and people were able to get into the fields much, much earlier than they were this year. So in comparison to 2012, when about 90% of the U.S. corn crop was planted. So a big difference between last year and this year. So again, we're below average in terms of percent for corn planted. So looking at the drought monitor, a comparison of 1 month ago versus the most recent drought monitor, which is valid for Tuesday, May 14th. You can see that there is some improvement over most of the region. However, we do have an increase in the D4 category, particularly for Colorado and Kansas. So an enhancement of that exceptional drought category. But we do have, in the eastern portion where the drought extended into Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota, we do have a portion of that that has slowly been chipped away through the precipitation that we've received over the last month. That's been able to eat away somewhat at the drought conditions. So we're improving slowly over time, but we still have some major areas of concern that would be in the Dakotas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. So we're still certainly concerned about drought issues for that region. In the table below, at the bottom of the slide, it shows a comparison of categorically no drought conditions, D1 to D4, and so on, current versus 1 week ago versus 3 months ago versus 1 year ago. Obviously, there are some big differences between 1 year ago. If we compare the most recent drought monitor with the drought monitor of last October, the peak of the drought was about September. Here's a comparison of October to May. And the table below, you can see a comparison of these values. So we were able to eat away some at the D4 category. That's certainly better than it was, but it's still persistent, some of the D4 category. So overall, we're in better shape. We've certainly had improvements in the Midwest region, had a lot of rainfall, so we've had improvements and have gone to no drought in the eastern portion. And if we branch out a bit and look at the U.S. as a whole, look at the most recent drought monitor, that's on the left, 2013 versus where we were a year ago. There are some striking differences. However, in 2012, of course, over the course of the summer with the heat and the dryness, things deteriorated pretty rapidly over the course of the summer. So then the picture on the right is how we're starting out this year. So depending on the summer, how the summer goes, there's certainly something that we need to keep our eye on, particularly for the central and southern plains. Okay, one agricultural impact from the drought conditions in particular that I wanted to highlight was the winter wheat. So if we look at the most recent drought monitor, that's in red. If we overlay the major and minor wheat growing areas, you can see those in green. You can see that a little over half of the winter wheat growing areas is currently in drought. If we look at the condition of winter wheat, obviously this is something that's planted last September into October, and so we were planting in drought conditions. And if we look at the percent by each state that's rated poor to very poor condition, you can see how that ranks. This is as of May 12th, Sunday. So the arrows there have highlighted some of the states that are in the region that we're concerned with today. So Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Texas. You can see that has a very high percentage of poor to very poor condition. So almost half of the winter wheat is rated poor to very poor, so that's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. One thing that has exacerbated the drought impacts to the winter wheat are the freeze events that we've seen, especially in Kansas. We saw some late season freezes in April that have done some damage to the winter wheat crop. And most recently, we've experienced some extreme heat. Over this last week, we've had 100-degree temperatures across the region. So the late freeze and the extreme heat are something that is damaging this already stressed crop. So something we're keeping an eye on. Another thing that's of concern is the pasture conditions across the plains, primarily the high plains, central plains. So if we look at percent of pasture and rangeland in poor or very poor condition, this is as of early May. You can see that some of these states, Nebraska, Colorado, North Dakota, Kansas, those all have more than half of the percent in poor to very poor condition. And if we look at how anomalous this is, to have this high percentage, then we're looking at more than 50% relative to this time of year. So it's a bit unusual to have this amount of poor to very poor condition for pasture land. So going forward, if we look at some precipitation forecasts, we'll look at outlooks, and we'll look at 1 month and 3 month outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center, and look into the drought outlooks. So if we look at precipitation forecast over the next week, you can see that there's a lot of color on this graphic. So a lot of the country is expected to get some rain over the next 7 days. This will primarily be occurring over the next 3 to 5 days. And the amounts aren't necessarily too important. Those can certainly change, but you can see that much of the country is expected to get some rainfall. The heaviest is likely to be experienced in the northern plains, as well as the southeast. So we are looking like going into an active weather pattern over the next week. So if we look at some of the hazards over the next week to 10 days as well. So we've got quite a bit of information on this graphic. So in the brown, you're looking at severe or worse drought category. So that's similar to the drought monitor graphic that I showed. But into this weekend and to next week, we're looking at chances for severe weather. That's kind of in the orange outlined categories there. We're looking at chances for heavy rainfall, showing up for Minnesota and portions of Illinois and Missouri. And for portions of the Mississippi Basin, this is certainly important. If you can think back to the flooding graphic that I showed earlier, and potential for flooding. So this is something that we're expected to continue to see flood conditions along portions of the Mississippi River. We're also expected to see much above normal temperatures over the next week to 14 days. That's outlined in red there. And we have dry conditions. Obviously, we're in drought, and so that's increasing the chance for wildfire in the southern plains. If we look at the 8 to 14-day temperature outlook, this is from the Climate Prediction Center. So we're looking at probabilities of above and below normal temperatures and above and below normal precipitation. So for much of the Central Plains and a little bit overlapping into the west, we're expecting above normal temperatures, whereas the southeast and inching into the Midwest as well as the West Coast, we're expecting below normal temperatures. If we look at precipitation, there's a swath of below normal precipitation expected for southern plains and into the west, and above normal for the portions of the Midwest and into the east. So this is going out to almost the end of May. If we look at June specifically, again, it's from Climate Prediction Center. We can see above normal temperatures for much of the western half of the U.S. and southern plains. We're also expected to see below normal precipitation for much of this area. So for June, the odds are favoring warmer than normal and drier than normal for the western portion of the region. Equal chances for the Midwest portion of the U.S. There's no favor necessarily in the tilt of the odds toward above or below normal. If we look at summer as a whole, for much of the country, above normal temperatures are likely. If we look at precipitation, there are areas of below normal precipitation. So this is a similar graphic that I had showed earlier in terms of snow water equivalent, but this one happens to be for a stream flow forecast, and this is for spring and summer stream flow forecast, and this was done at the beginning of May. So you can see the percent based on the most recent 30-year average. You can see a lot of the Rockies, especially the southern portions, are in the yellow and red colors, meaning below normal stream flow conditions for spring and summer. A little bit above normal in the far north, but for the majority of the west, we're looking at below normal stream flow conditions. So combining all these factors, we talked about warmer conditions, we talked about drier conditions and where those are expected to be located. If we look at the U.S. seasonal drought outlook, this was released today, and it's valid from today through the end of August. So through the end of summer, we're expecting persistence of drought in much of the West. We're expecting some development of drought in some of these marginal areas. We're expecting some improvement in the Central Plains, and some improvement as we move further to the east. So this is similar to the change in the drought monitor graphics that I showed earlier, where we have this slow improvement of the drought conditions going from the Midwest into the plains. So we're expecting that type of pattern to continue going forward. However, note that where we do have the areas of the most exceptional drought in portions of southern Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado, that is expected to persist. So we're likely to continue to see impacts in this region, as well as the other portions of the region where we're still in drought conditions. Okay, if we look at fire danger, this is a significant wildland fire potential. So large fires is what this graphic is talking about. This is for June, for next month. In the west, given that we are likely to see above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation, then we're increasing the likelihood for significant wildland fire activity. So in summary, if we think back to the climate graphics that I showed at the beginning, we've seen colder and wetter than normal for much of the region. We've seen some late season snows that have occurred and record snowfalls. The cold was for much of the middle of the country. The wet was for the Midwest part of the country primarily, has been over the last month. We've had some flooding along the Mississippi and Illinois River. Over the last month, we've had near record to record-setting river crests. So the flood conditions are expected to continue over the next week or so in this region. Talked a little bit about winter wheat. We've had spring freezes and some extreme heat recently that have affected this already stressed crop, which was planted when soil moisture conditions were very, very dry. So this is something that we're concerned about. We've had a delay in spring field work throughout the region due to wet and cold conditions. It's been primarily wet in the Midwest. They've received quite a bit of rain, and so these wet fields have prevented people from getting into the fields on time. We've had colder than normal conditions a bit further to the west. So the cold has been more of what's prevented field work in the west, and the wetness has been the primary factor that has prevented field work in the east. In terms of outlooks, we are expecting the ENSO neutral conditions. They're forecasted through the fall of 2013. So these are expected to continue. So it's a pattern that we have been in recently. So we don't see anything significant that's projecting that to change in the near term. We're expecting the drought conditions to continue in the west, some possible improvement in the central U.S., so maybe continued sort of eating away at the drought from coming in from the east. The forecast in the short term over the next week calls for precipitation across much of the U.S. There's likely for severe weather outbreak this weekend and after. And the monthly and seasonal outlooks that I showed that have just been released illustrate continued warmth in the west and central and dryness in the central and southern plains. If you would like further information about today's webinar, or if you'd like to look at or even watch previous webinars, you can find those at the websites listed here. If you'd like climate information in particular, a monthly climate report, you can find those at the National Climate Data Center. If you're interested in climate outlooks, short-term or long-term, the Climate Prediction Center URL is listed here. And there are a number of other resources that you can try. We have the Climate Portal, the U.S. Climate Portal, the U.S. Drought Portal, of course the National Drought Mitigation Center, state climatologists, or regional climate centers. So there are a number of resources that are offered to help answer your questions. Okay, here's a list of some of the folks that have contributed to this webinar and past webinars and help compile all this information together. I'd be happy to answer any questions here. I know there's a couple of other panelists that are with me as well, or you could send one of us an email listed here. So John, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Martha. Excellent presentation today. And Jessica, let's open up for questions.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. There are no questions at this time. I turn the call back over to the presenters.
Thank you, Jessica. And if we have no other questions for Martha or anybody else on the panel today, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And our next webinar will be on Thursday, June 20th at 1 p.m. Central. And we'll send out information on that later. And this recording and the presentation will be